the Labour CND podcast. Like our parent campaign for nuclear disarmament, we're advocating for peace, justice, and a nuclear-free future. As Labour Party members, our emphasis is on what the government could be doing to achieve lasting security for people and planet. We're confident that most people in Britain support this, and we're working to make sure the government hears our voices. You'll find our podcasts on Spotify, YouTube, and Insta. If you feel the same, please give us a listen, give us a like, and give us a follow. My name is Carol Turner. I'm presenting today's podcast, and I'll be talking to Alex Gordon from the RMT, the National Union of Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers, about military spending. But first, for those of you who don't yet know Alex, let me tell you a bit about it. Most recently, he's been part of the CND and RMT team that published the Alternative Defence Review at the beginning of June, and that was in response to the Strategic Defence Review that the government is conducting. We'll be hearing more about that later from Alex. He was vice chair of the working group that prepared the report, and it was a collaboration between CND, trade unionists, climate activists, and academics. Until recently, Alex was the president of the RMT, and he's been a member of the national executive. Nowadays, he's chair of the Paddington branch of the RMT. He's a train driver again, and he remains a very active trade unionist. Alex is also an anti-war campaigner. He's a national officer of Stop the War Coalition and a member of the steering committee of the People's Assembly Against Austerity. And Alex tells me something I didn't know before this podcast, that he was a member of Youth CND in the 1980s. He does, however, have a life outside politics, and that includes cycling, belonging to a group called Pedal for Progress, and fundraising. So welcome, Alex. Thank you very much for joining us. What we're going to talk about today is the following. We know from recent announcements by the Prime Minister that defence spending will go up to 2.5% from 2007 onwards, and that he wants to raise it to 3% by the next Parliament. This decision has already been resulted in cuts to the international aid and welfare budgets, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the IFS, is saying that more cuts are inevitable. Military spending is the only area of government spending where an overall budget has been set without first being subjected to the stringent spending tests which the Chancellor has insisted on for all other department budgets: health, education, housing, local government, and of course transport, which is the RMT's particular area. So thanks for joining us, Alex. Let's take the first question, if I may, and that is, as a senior figure in the RMT, can you give us a quick summary of what your union's reaction to military spending is?
Well, I don't think the latest announcement that we heard this week, just gone from the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, in the Strategic Defence Review, comes as any kind of shock. It's been clear for some time that not just the current government, but their predecessors were intent on increasing the proportion of GDP that Britain spends on arms and military spending. And that was very clear from Conservative ministers and politicians before July 2024. And it's been clear immediately after the general election last July from John Healey, the current Defence Secretary, and from his boss, and indeed from the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, who's excluded defence spending from her cross-departmental spending review taking place this week. So within the RMT, there's been a discussion taking place for a number of years about the implications of this. And it's not just a discussion that's taking place within our union, it takes place between other unions in this country and beyond. So in 2023, the RMT, through discussions with our colleagues and comrades in the Maritime Union of Australia, who have an anti-nuclear and anti-AUKUS policy, we started to develop a critique of this incredible spending ramp that's going on around military spending and its implications for public services and public transport, but also its implications for society more generally and the threat of the increased threat of war and global conflict. So we had a discussion with the Australian Union, the Maritime Union of Australia, back in 23. We concluded from that our union needed to take a much more proactive position critiquing and opposing increases in military expenditure. And at our 2023 national conference, we particularly noted the expanding number of NATO troops that were being called on, and the escalation of military spending as a result of NATO's summit in Madrid in June 2022. And indeed, we noted that President Biden, the US president at that time, his announcement that the United States was going to establish military bases in Poland, Romania, and air missile systems in Italy and Germany, as well as 2 additional F-35 squadrons based in the UK. And of course, CND has been actively campaigning this year against the arrival of F-35 squadrons with tactical nuclear capabilities at Lakenheath, United States Air Force Base. So that was the discussion that we were engaged in 2023. And really in the last year, we've seen that it's necessary to develop a policy for the labour movement, a policy that commits it to work for peace and calls for peaceful resolution of global disputes through diplomacy, peace talks, and disarmament. Because unless we develop a policy for peace, we can see that the trade unions in this country, including some of the very largest trade unions, are going to be sucked into a militarist policy. And, you know, the British trade union movement is an important historical and social actor. It has, at times in its history, adopted a policy which has been to support governments who want to go to war. But it's equally true that our trade union movement has been a powerful and compelling player, an actor for peace at numerous times in our history. So we really think that from the point of view of the RMT, it's essential that we should campaign with other trade unions and peace organisations such as CND to convene a labour and peace movement summit to work out the basis of a new foreign policy with the promotion of peace and social justice at its heart. And that would include the requirement to campaign for socially useful, well-paid unionised jobs to replace investment in arms production, including a commitment to build a campaign for defence diversification on the principles of just transition, so that skills, jobs, and the communities that depend on them are safeguarded. And that's the approach that RMT has taken towards the very real and very well telegraphed increases in defence spending and military spending from this government and the last one.
Thanks very much, Alex. That was a very thorough explanation of where RMT is at. And for CND and peace activists, a very pleasing one. It's good to know that an important trade union in Britain is on the case of what's happening at the moment. I am going to ask you some more general questions about military spending. Just before I do, let's take as the second question a very brief, if you would, description of the Alternative Defence Review, which you and the RMT have helped to produce. I mentioned that in the introduction. It's just been made public. So what do you think are the main takeaways from this report in a short paragraph, please?
Excuse me. Well, what we've tried to do in what is a relatively short and digestible document, it's around about 40 pages, is to bring together established arguments and facts about defence spending and its impact on our country, our society, as well as the world and the globe and the climate crisis. And we've, first of all, tried to set out in a very clear and digestible form with references how the argument for increased defence spending, arms spending, has been advanced through the British state in the past several years, the past few years. And there's a particular war narrative that Starmer now depends on, which was developed originally by Boris Johnson and has been passed on from the Conservatives to Labour in government. And it's a narrative that is fundamentally based on a neoconservative approach towards policy formation. And it's a very sinister and worrying narrative. And we've tried to really examine that in detail and give some examples of the way in which it's been imported into our own domestic political conversations. We've looked at the way that the government promotes its war narrative through the media, through schools, through universities, and the influence of arms companies on almost every avenue of our public life, and the harm that this does to us as a society, including the economic damage that it does to communities that become dependent on arms companies as their only means of employment. And then we've really set out the scale of the waste and irrelevance of military spending in Britain, including some of the most heinous, most wasteful examples. The recent, I won't list them for you now because I'm being brief, but there's a list of incredible spending commitments which have sucked up public money in the last decade that could have been used to give us the social infrastructure that we so desperately need. We've shown that the nuclear weapons policy that is at the heart of the government's strategic defence review and the heart of the government's defence policy is fundamentally a dangerous policy that doesn't give us security and is actually poisoning many of our communities which are host to these nuclear bases. And we've shown that the myth that is now being promoted by the Starmer government, that arms spending generates jobs and economic growth, is not true. So all of this is laid out in quite a lot of detail, but it's, I think, a very readable document. And then we've shown the alternative, which is to argue for a policy of defence diversification and just transition towards socially useful employment. And the trade unions are going to be the key players and the key battleground in this argument. So these arguments are prepared and laid out in order that peace activists and trade unionists can access them, use them, and debate them in their own organisations.
Thanks, Alex. In other words, it's a document that both yourself and CND wants to encourage the activists to read, and we're giving details of that a bit later on at the end of the podcast as such. Let's move on to a couple more general questions that also take up the issue of trade unions and jobs, which is so important in the Alternative Defence Review and to you and other unions. So every government that raises defence spending always claims it's going to be good for jobs. The current government is making the same claims. If you've seen if you've seen John Healey on the TV or heard him on the radio, he's been focusing on how many jobs will be produced. Similarly with Keir Starmer and other spokespeople for the Labour Party. Do you really agree that that's the case? Are we going to get more jobs?
No, it's not the case. If you look at the Strategic Defence Review, the claims that it makes for employment generation, they're very, very modest at a cost of a huge amount of money that could generate far more employment and far more useful employment if that investment was put into health, transport, education, or almost any other part of the public sector. So start with the claim that defence, as they call it, contributes significantly to the UK's economic growth is misleading. Arms sales make up less than 0.004% of the Treasury's total revenue, and the defence sector accounts for only 1% of the UK's economic output. So it's a tiny minority of the economic activity in this country that is receiving an enormous amount of priority in terms of public investment with public funds. Secondly, the profit that's generated in the arms industry isn't reinvested in the UK. The arms industry's biggest firm in this country, BAE Systems, is effectively a joint US-UK company. A majority of its capital is invested in the United States, and a majority of its shareholders are US investment companies, of which BlackRock is the largest. And it has the biggest footprint for state corporate lobbying in this country. So these companies are taking money out of our economy and investing the profits that they take out into their investments elsewhere. That's the first point I want to make about that myth of an engine of growth coming from the arms sector. And in terms of jobs, this assertion that the arms sector, the defence industries, so-called, are an engine of growth is similarly a distortion. The number of workers employed in the defence sector is around about 5% of the total in all manufacturing in this country, and only about 0.5% of those work in full-time work in the UK. So most of them work outside this country. They work in various supply chains. And in fact, defence employment is very, very regionally concentrated. About 31% of the jobs in the arms industry in this country are based in the northwest of England, towns like Barrow in Furness, for example, which is dependent on the nuclear submarine plant that BAE has in Barrow. And this dependency on military contracts has been shown to be highly damaging to the environment, but also to the economy of the local area. Historically, Barrow in Furness was a diversified shipyard. It had naval shipbuilding, but it also took on a number of other jobs, including, by the way, doing mechanical engineering for British Railways. This reliance on a single source of employment is a very recent phenomenon, and it places those towns and those communities in peril. Because if President Trump decides that he's going to move US manufacturing investment back to the United States, which is what he says he wants to do, then they're going to be left without any alternative employment at all. They're effectively completely reliant on the goodwill of the United States government, which is not a wise place for anyone to be. So we're very critical, and I'm very critical of this whole myth that is being pushed by John Healey and Keir Starmer, that arms spending and military spending represents a good investment for jobs and for the economy more generally.
Yeah. Labour CND is completely with you there, Alex. We did some work in the late 80s and early 90s on defence spending. And at that time, the resolutions that went to Labour Party conference were overwhelmingly carried because they had the majority support from the trade unions. And the work that we did in analysing defence spending, its rises and falls and so on, and also having a look at the material produced by others, by sort of experts and economists and so on, it was pretty clear then, and I would be very confident in saying it's pretty clear nowadays, that any developments in the so-called defence industry actually come about as a result of improvements in automation, the introduction of AI and so on. And that tends to reduce rather than increase jobs. It would be very interesting to see someone do a report on that nowadays, along the lines that were available in the sort of 80s and 90s. We'd be very interested.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree, Carolyn. If you look at the announcement that Starmer made a week ago with the Strategic Defence Review, the claims that are made for job creation are extremely modest. I think I'm right in saying that from an investment of, I think, 1.5 billion in new factories, the Strategic Defence Review estimates the creation of 1,800 jobs, less than 2,000 jobs. In fact, even that figure it says 1,000 plus jobs in the actual Strategic Defence Review paper. So that is £1.5 billion to create 1,000 plus jobs. I mean, that's an extraordinary ratio. That's £833,000 per job created. So you're right. These investments are not about job creation. These investments are going to be reliant on robots. They're going to be highly capital intensive. They're not going to be job intensive. They're not going to create an economic well-being factor for people in those communities.
Absolutely. And insofar as there are extra jobs, they're likely to be in those parts of the industry which are semi-skilled or unskilled and relatively low paid. Let me move you on to the final question, if I may. Despite what you're saying about the lack of impact on jobs that raising military spending actually has, despite that, the TUC and many individual unions, important large unions, support increases in military spending. It's very comforting, very much a cause for optimism that the RMT does not, as you explained earlier. But what would the RMT want instead of creating those jobs? What sort of an improvement in employment would you like to see in this country? What do you want instead?
Well, I mean, what we're calling for in the sectors where we organise workers is a huge investment in public transport, which, despite all the shiny new trains and indeed new underground lines that you see in London and in parts of London anyway, and the southeast of England, if you travel outside of the southeast of England, you're traveling on trains that are 30, 40 years old, railway lines that are in desperate need of investment, cities such as Liverpool, Manchester, Hull, which, the distances between them are relatively small. The time taken to travel between them is incredibly long. So we've got a transport network in this country that is essentially still based around Victorian railway companies' ideas of where railway lines should go. We can't design a high-speed rail system in this country and implement it because we've managed to give the private sector essentially use it as a trough to enrich themselves for the last decade. There's a huge area of infrastructure spending and infrastructure investment, which should be the priority rather than military spending. But of course, it's not just about railways or buses, important as they are in people's lives. It's about the need for social infrastructure. We've got a shortage of nurses, we've got a shortage of doctors, a shortage of teachers, we've got a shortage of plumbers, we've got a shortage of all sorts of skilled jobs in this country that we need people to work in. And there is no national plan coming forward from this government to create the social infrastructure that we so obviously need. And that's before you even start to consider the challenges, the real security threats and challenges that we all face from climate change. The need to have more resilient infrastructure, the need to reinforce and rebuild ancient 100-year-old viaducts and bits of our cities that are crumbling because of lack of investment. The lack of insulation in so much of our housing stock, the lack of housing stock. Now, all of these are the priority. That's what is the real threat to our security and our well-being, not scare stories about Russia or China invading us, which is just a ludicrous. It's just a ludicrous scare story that's being promoted by highly paid generals and media commentators who, when they retire, will have jobs in arms companies where they have a revolving door. It's a completely corrupt relationship between the so-called security specialists who we hear on our news programs telling us earnestly that we face a threat from invasion from Russia or from China. It's a completely corrupt relationship between them and the companies who are making profits from our taxes, from our investment, our public investment in the arms industry. So I think what we need to do is we need to just puncture the balloon, explode the myths, explain to people what the real relationship between their future security and investment in public services is. There's no magic bullet to this. We have to get the argument across to hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people in this country that they're being lied to about a foreign threat. The real threat to our security comes from people who are trying to get their hands in our pockets in order to ensure that their profits are secure, not that we're secure.
No, absolutely. We did an interview, Labour CND did a podcast interview with an economist in just at the beginning of April, at the time just after the budget, spring budget. And he made absolutely the same point very concisely. He said, the only people who benefit from increased spending in the defence industry are the shareholders in the manufacturing companies. And I think that's absolutely right. Alex, that was fantastically enjoyable to talk to you. We've covered very quickly a big range of important topics. I hope we're going to be able to come back to you on different aspects of what you've been saying in the future. We are going to specifically cover the climate impact of the sort of things that your report is talking about. But thank you very much indeed for a very illuminating discussion. And I hope that all of our listeners appreciate the effort that's being put in. Thanks very much.
Thank you.